First speaker is from Trend Micro, Hitomi Kimura. The title of the talk is On the Eve of Code Signing Transformation. Kimura-san, over to you.
Thank you for your introduction. My name is Kimura from Trend Micro. And today I'd like to talk about the eve of the code signing transformation and for the next 10 minutes or so. So normally I am working as an incident response analyst for EDR. I'm an EDR analyst. And in responding to incident, if we find something new, then I will report as precisely as possible. And so I also emphasize my reporting. From 2016, I moved to US and I work at Trend Micro in US. I'm very interested in PKI, and so long-time PKI watcher. I've been working as that. So today's document and part of the screenshots. There would be some company names, and that would be fictitious and so innocent, and so we'd like to blur that before making it available to you. And so 2022 was a difficult year for code assigning, and the valid assigned driver abuse continued one after another, as was reported during this year. Ransomware actors and target attacked, and actors' names are up as examples. In July 2022, there was the antivirus, anti-GDOT driver, and ransomware actors stopped the antivirus software. And you probably read about the spread of the virus, and I was in charge of that case. And the impact was large in this case. And that itself was a shock, but in December 2022, there was a report from Microsoft at the end of the year that the device driver, the developer program to develop that, a particular account, thought that the malicious driver was a legitimate one and had received the site signature, and then there was a malicious driver with a legitimate name, and so that was another incident. And again, this was a shocking case. It was from about July 2027 or 22, and there was a point of entry threat actor. There was a malicious certificate, and it was used in numerous amount. And there was a code signing on the module, and that certificate, if you investigate, then normally you would oversee it, but that the Cargbot itself got the issuance from the certificate authority, and we saw a number of elements as such, which were not explicitly reported in the past, but gradually these became apparent during that year. And so code signing, there are diverse abuse scenarios, and maybe almost all out there. It's that diverse, and in particular, the assigned module, the vulnerable ones, the abuse of them is bring your own vulnerable driver, and it is at its peak. And the second point in detail, it was reported at the end of 2022, SolarWinds and supply chain. He had introduced some malicious code, and as deliverables, the module with a legitimate signature came out, and that had been distributed. And that also was a very big impact. And then there was another classical case, and there was a legitimate certificate, and the private key was stolen. And as mentioned, the attackers, they spoofed being a proper company, a real company, and the attacker prepared a company and getting the certificate issued there. And those incidents are continuously being observed. And lastly, this again was shocking news, and it was in 2012, MD5 hash conflict was used. It was a falsification of a certificate, and normally you use it in science and research, and it's a case, an output as a scientific research, but it was reported as a cyber attack, and the CA compromise in the context of code assigning has not been reported so far, but up until now, like back in 2011, the attacker used the RA and got the certificate issuance from the CA, and back then, the attacker, what they wanted the most was Komei it was like a web certificate that they wanted at that time, like google.com. And so they motivated to getting the driver signature. And so next, they'll probably come after the certificates from the CA. If they can get these issued freely, then the co-signing certificate will definitely be issued in the future, as we can foresee. So these are the points to be focused, and the abuse of the code signing, I think that you're all expecting is a revocation of a certificate is not going to work as well as we expect. Of course, it's better to revoke than not to revoke, but like bring your vulnerable driver, like a case, the private key is not compromised, and so I don't think the certificate is going to be revoked. And even if it was to be revoked, is it going to be blocked on all computers? No, it depends on the conditions. So the certificate revoked module, it might not operate. You cannot make sure that it does not operate in any of the computers in the company. And so, as the blue team in the companies, I don't think that this kind of a mechanism would be acceptable. So what is CA doing? The CA Browser Forum, this is an industrial association, and they know that the way it is not going to work. And so discussions are taking place, but there's no decisive factor to it. And another thing is the certification issuance process is that to be suspected. It was only like a single or a few stolen certificates used by APT. And that was the well-known scenario up to now. But now the attackers, from history, they have several number of certificates, and we know that. And so if you look at the contents of the abused certificates, then you know that the attackers have probably been issued certificates, and we also receive such reports. And so we look into the contents of the certificates. Taking a look, these are the 2 out of the 7 used in the attack. And it's a micro company, UK company, mail address used, and it was a unique domain, and the username was the same. But in the first domain, one domain, it was .cot. It's not normally used. And another was farmer. The code signing used for farmer, and this were issued from the same CA. And comparing the two companies, they're about 200 kilometers apart, and the two domain names, if you take a look, then they're using the same hosting service. And from that, you know that the same name server is being used. And so from that, you can see that the same applicant had applied for these two certificates. And as a possibility, for example, we'll say that the subcontracting software company were compromised, and maybe led to this case. You're led to think so, but they're interested in co-signing, but not hosting a website. That is weird. And so we are coordinating with the CA, and this case is still under investigation. So these are the history of the abused code signing from the past. And I've created a list. And so if you're interested, please take a look. So currently, the code signing cannot stay as is, and transformation is expected. Abuse is not easy, but if you work hard, then you can abuse, and this status is continuing. And particularly, abuse of the code-signed drivers have become some sweet spots for these attackers, like Sasaki-san's session mentioned cost. And the cost benefit is very big for them. And so it's become a sweet spot for them. So we see big change in 2022. I feel the change. PKI is have been struggling, but it's almost at its limits. And the co-signing, according to PKI, will continue to be abused. And I think we are on the eve of a transformation, but we don't see the dawn coming. And so what's the future perspective? The CT, if introduced for the code signing certificate issuance process, that's good, but it's still under in discussion on CABF. And if they talk about, or if they work on the revocation of the malware-based revocation, then that might work. But difficult to verify the revocation. There's no change in that. And also regarding private key theft and leakage, and this has been worked on. And in June of 2023, you have to have a key on the hard token, and the rule will change then. And so it will not be abused as much as it was in the past, but they're not all decisive factors. And on a long-term basis, this store method, and you use it on the bio terminals, and we may apply this for endpoints, and it could be very attractive in a safety aspect, but platform-wise, we don't have enough power. And the supply chain, the code integrity needs a new mechanism because there's more or compromised supply chain. And so like binary transparency and SIG-store, and you've heard about them. So we use a code that can be verified, and we want to transform to work that way. And if so, is PKI codes signing, the code integrity and trust can be realized with one technology, but then this will be spread throughout the supply chain, and it will become a de facto standard. And so such would be the way to secure integrity. And we are about to transform, and I'll be happy to see such a transformation. So, how should I put it? Still, technology is only emerging, and we don't know how it's going to be deployed. But this current mood, I be happy if I can share this mood with you today. So, in the future, as we see the evolution of the new technology, then maybe we can see the dawn of the code signing, and I'd look forward to such a publication. Thank you very much.
From Team T5, we would like to invite Still Shu. He is going to share his message on video with the title Brief History of MustangPanda and its PlugX Evolution.
Panda goes full global, how MustangPanda refuses to abandon PlugX. This presentation is a shortened version of our observation and findings of the MustangPanda group over the last few years. Before we get started, let me introduce myself real quick. My name is Still, sometimes known as Asuka. I'm currently working as a threat intelligence researcher over at Team T5. I've been tracking the threat group Polaris, also known as MustangPanda, for quite some time now. A quick disclaimer, the following research has been extensive joint research with Sean Sabo over at Record Future. We've been extensively working with each other on researching parts of this group for well over a year. This research would have been far more annoying to tackle if it weren't for help of him and advice from my colleagues. So, who are Polaris and what have they done over the last few years? To understand what we're discussing here today, we need a very brief history lesson on the threat group. Polaris, based on our knowledge, has been around and active since 2011. They are a Chinese-based APT group that is highly interested in tactics that involve some degree of social engineering and antique infection methods such as via removal devices. They were previously heavily focused towards geopolitical-related countries such as Myanmar and Mongolia, as well as other Asian countries such as Japan, Philippines, Singapore, and more. In a nutshell, Polaris loves PlugX. In the age where most of the modern APT groups have moved away from older rats to newer and more sophisticated ones, Polaris refuses to abandon ship and continues to use PlugX as their primary arsenal. Instead of moving away from this decade-old rat, they've decided to continue to evolve and add on to or even rewrite parts of this malware to make it work on modern systems and find ways to evade detections. Over the last few years, we've observed that several variants were developed and deployed against a wide variety of targets. For example, Polaris' exclusive version of PlugX, better known as Thor in some reports that have surfaced online. A variant of PlugX that gets loaded via RTO decompressed buffer and uses Thor identifier as opposed to the typical plug. And then there's PlugDisk, a PlugX variant with USB infection and stealer capability added on top, whose origin can be traced back to UDisk shell, used by the same group a few years back. And finally, there's MiniPlug, a miniaturized and possibly rewritten version of PlugX that began to crop up in 2022, which we'll get to in a little bit. So, what's new exactly? We've noticed that over the last few years they've begun to expand their territories to other parts of the world, employing new tech that isn't exactly new, and trying to be less blatant with their social engineering skills, but also not really. So first off, expand the territory. Previously, between 2019 to 2011, most of the samples were being spotted in Asia, with few coming from Europe who were likely individuals looking into the samples. Note that this isn't exactly a concrete sample count, this was a quick estimate that pulled off of based on an internal aggregate data. Now if we add 2022 to the mix, we can see a number of samples in Europe has increased drastically. So what happened exactly? Because of time constraints, we won't be able to delve into too much details here. Essentially, Polaris was using a fairly classic technique where a legitimate executable, malicious loader, and an encoded blob is put next to each other. The encoded blob was using a 10-byte ASCII passphrase terminated with a null byte, and the rest of the blob is XORed by the same passphrase. Simple stack streams were also used to avoid basic strings-based signature detections. Later in 2020, we noticed that the number of bytes in the XOR key has increased from 10 to more than 20. And here's where the frequency of changes began to ramp up. In late 2021, we began to discover PlugDisk and the use of a new payload encoding scheme, as well as control flow flattened obfuscations being employed on both the loader and the payload. We were quick to come up with relevant decoders and threat hunting tools to continue our observations. We also kept quiet and kept most of these investigations under wrap. Here you can see one of the earlier sample command handling routine was relatively simple and was still fairly easy to comb through. However, in the next few days, we began to see cases where tools like IDA was really starting to struggle with being able to properly analyze and or decompile the relevant functions as the obfuscation began to crop up. We won't be able to go into details here, but we were quickly able to identify that the binary is likely being obfuscated with a custom OLVM implementation, whose resulting code looks suspiciously close to another project on GitHub, also known as yet another not-so-obfuscated LLVM. Aside from the control flatten code, the group also ditched the standard prepended XOR key method they were using from the decoding algorithm. Instead, they moved on to something a little bit more simple, albeit also more mathematically involved encoding method. At this point, we were still following along the developments nicely, though certainly more cautious. However, another strange development took place around January 2022, shortly before the Chinese New Year holidays. We noticed a new sample that was named State Aid Commission Approves 2022 to 2027 Regional Aid Map for Greece. And this sample is being flagged with the PlugDisk pattern. So what's going on here? The outer shell was a simple downloader that downloads 4 files. A decoy file that is displayed to a user, and a legitimate executable malicious loader, and an encoded blob. Sounds familiar? That's because the resulting payload was indeed similar to a PlugX sample, but looks oddly small and behaves differently. The payload encoding scheme was also changed slightly, with a different set of keys being used for all of the subsequent samples. There were so many things that just weren't adding up in this investigation. First of all, Polaris, while they had previously targeted EU countries, had never specifically went out of their way to target EU like this. The payload encoding scheme was also changed, and the downloader was used, and the PlugX behavior was odd to say the least. Not only was the half of the PlugX behavior missing, it also supported fewer command codes, from what we could tell anyways. The HTTP headers were never before seen, and because of the OLVM layer, it wasn't exactly easy to just begin disassembling and tearing down the inner workings of it. We were able to give it a new name based on the observation though, aptly named MiniPlug due to its incredibly different yet familiar behavior and statistics. After this, we kept observing what the group was doing for this EU-specific campaign that is still ongoing to this day. In fact, one of the recent one was as recent as January 2023. We noticed that the encoding schemes were being tampered with using varying degrees of XOR methods, whether it's with a static offset, with an appended shellcode, or with a predetermined file size. Speaking of the shellcode, one of the tidbits where you realized that some of these blobs actually contained shellcode at the end of the file that was used to XOR decode the blob. These shellcodes were so specific that their origin can be traced back to another incident involving Polaris back in 2018, allowing us to further tie the operation to the group. Here's the benign shellcode that appeared simple enough, yet weren't so common in the sea of malware. We noticed that there were several more TTP changes over the last few years, such as them attempting to use various launchers that weren't so tied to that identity, how they stopped using Adobe Acrobat, Adobe Photoshop, Advanced, and others. They were also starting to use other distribution methods, such as using ISOs instead of RARs or zips. They were also launching more frequent attacks. We could often see at least one sample or two every month or even more these days. Here you can see that they have bundled decoy documents within encoded blob instead of having them being a separate component. They were also continuing to rotate the C2 servers so that the indicators almost never overlap with another operation or attack. In conclusion, Polaris is continuing to evolve their TTP and has been doing so ever since late 2020. They now appear to have multiple ongoing operations targeting various countries or industries, utilizing various malwares such as MiniPlug for EU, PlugDisk or PlugX Fast for general infiltration of various Asian entities, or Southeast Asia specific operations using other newly in-house developed malware like No5, which unfortunately is out of scope for today's discussion. So we'll leave that for another day, I suppose. And that'll be it for my presentation. Thank you, JSAC, for the opportunity, and hope to see you again with a full-length presentation next time.
Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for waiting. We would like to resume inviting Mr. Shoichi Ando from SP Technology on consideration of unauthorized sign-in to Azure AD and real-time blocking. Ando-san. Thank you for the kind introduction. I would like to talk about unauthorized sign in to Azure AD and real-time blocking. Let me introduce who I am. I am Ando with SB Technology. I used to be a systems integrator, but since last year I started working on phishing research and joining the team. I was here yesterday, and it was to my delight that I was able to see and meet with the Twitter account holders who I've been following all day long. So I'm very honored to stand here and speak in front of you today. Introduction. I would like to talk about the background of where I come from, and also would like to talk about the abused IP addresses that you can see from the unauthorized Azure AD signing in. And also would like to talk about the massive spam mail sent out as a case example of the account breach happened in short time. Introduction. As you probably know, Microsoft 365 is the cloud services that has multiple functions that is often used in enterprises for communication and businesses. And many use this as the in-house infrastructure and the services offered from Microsoft 365 cloud services. Microsoft 365 can provide the infrastructure and application and protect you from the threats, but accounts and data would need to be under the responsibilities of the users. They need to be prepared for themselves, especially with the hijacking and misconfiguration to prevent the data leakage. Because of its architecture, there are a lot of information assets in Microsoft 365, so if there's an hijacking, there's a significant risk. To reduce this risk, it is the mainstay of the day that multiple authentication factors are combined. With regards to the attacks on multi-factor authentication, the often case that you hear is MFA fatigue, and it is basically using the social engineering. At the time, users are deceived. In that case, even with the MFA, unauthorized accesses will be allowed. With regards to Microsoft 365, account hijacking is most effectively prevented through the device authentication using Intune, but it is difficult to implement at the same time. Besides device authentication, we wanted to investigate whether there's any other information that can be utilized to prevent hijacking. By collecting the logs, we thought that it will be effective, so we would like to create an infrastructure for the account breach-related login. Microsoft 365 account-related credential theft happens with the phishing emails and URL, and we would like to propose creating the decoy account and collecting the sign log to mate to this account. I would like to share with you the IP addresses used in this investigation. From February last year to January this year, we have used a decoy account and collected a total of 13,362 attempts of access to this IP address. Out of it, 88.37% was one-time access, meaning that almost 90% of the IP address accesses were made only for a single time. Based on this, creating block risk based on the IP addresses is not so effective. Besides that, there were other information that could be useful. We have tried to match the data with the reputation database, and there were a total of 340 IP addresses that were originated from Japan based on the geo-IP information. Out of it, 64.12% or 218 cases were the ones that were related to VPN services, meaning that about 60% in Japan of the unauthorized accesses can be prevented if the VPN addresses were blocked. On the other hand, looking around the world, the VPN services reputation information was very limited. Only 32.13% or 4,210 cases were confirmed internationally. And this graph in red shows that the majority of the IP addresses were unknown. Some were actors themselves, some were breached hosts, and some were the IP addresses under the control of actors. But if we can analyze these IP addresses in further details, there may add some value. We assume that the breached decoy accounts are used in the VPN services. In the VPN services, we use the email addresses and trying to log into the VPN, and email services breach may happen in any organization and not just for the VPN services. The same email addresses were also used to confirm whether the other cloud services have been breached. If we can block the VPN IP addresses, then we can block the unauthorized accesses to up to 60%. But if you can, unfortunately, in the Microsoft 365, there's no single feature that allows the blocking of the VPN services. If we can use APIs, then we can use the external reputation and break the sign-in sessions. While we've done some investigations, we identified that there is some additional work required. In this configuration, the sign-in log output has some time logs, and there's some time lag with the reputation. And even after the session is made void, there's some time, which is about 10 to 20 minutes, until the actor is disabled. Of course, there's a breach that can be prevented with the configuration that I've mentioned, but 10 to 20 minutes is very crucial in some cases because the massive amounts of spam mails can be sent out during this time. In case the account is breached, the spam mails could be sent out, and this is the log for 1 hour time. As a result, these spam emails have been sent out with the account breach that had happened in a few minutes, and we couldn't even stop the sending out of the emails, even by revoking the sign-in session. Within a matter of a few minutes, the actor has executed several tens of thousands of email, and Exchange Online has already accepted the processing, so all these emails have been queued. The video on the right shows that these are the IP addresses and have been banned. We try to eliminate the actors to see the mailbox, but even with the actors unable to access these IP addresses, there are still a number of emails that are being sent out. Even if they cannot use the IP addresses, the spam mails keep sending out. In this case, the conclusion is that the blocking of email with the transport rule is the only way to address this incident. Stopping the account, changing the password, resetting the sessions, setting the limits to email protocols do not help sending out emails. Also, with the transport rules, even if we stop the sending out of the spam mails, the transmission queue is not erased. So until the queue is cleared, the mailbox keeps on sending the mail, and the legitimate mails cannot be sent out. Microsoft responded to us by saying that the queuing mail cannot be deleted. However, the limit on the sending queue can be changed. To prevent these damages from happening, we should block the accesses in real time during the account authentication, and the one feasible way to do this is as follows. I will not spare time to explain this in details, but one way is to use the Azure AD IT protection Microsoft Defender for cloud accession policy. Conclusion is that over the short period of time, if we want to stop the damage resulting from the account breach, one way to do this is the real-time blocking upon the authentication, and using API to suspend the accounts and revoking the sessions is also a viable way. And I'm not trying to eliminate any opportunities, but this could help to identify some of the areas that cannot be cleared just by blocking it. Eventually, the success rate and efficiency will be improved, but as of January 5, when I have created this deck, the single-time usage of IP address was 88.7%. And yesterday I've done the research again, and this rate has increased slightly. So over time, there will be much more improvement, I assume. Thank you very much. That's all for my presentation.
From Virus Total, Fernando, Diaz, Urbano will talk about digging for copper unseen findings of infamous Android malware.
ご紹介ありがとうございます。皆さん。
Introduction and hello everyone. And I don't have a confidence in giving presentation in Japanese, so please allow me to give presentation in English.
Today's talk is digging for copper, and it is about an Android banking Trojan. I will introduce myself very briefly, and we will see the key characteristics of this malware. So, my name is Fernando. I am a software engineer working at Virus Total, and I'm focused on the development of sandbox solutions and dynamic analysis. And I'm also the author of the FRIDA handbook. So if anyone is interested in learning about FRIDA, you can do so for free on the link in the slide. You can contact me anytime through my email for questions, or you can follow me on Twitter. Let's go to the actual contents of the presentation. Okay, so Copper is an Android banking Trojan that is targeting users from bank entities and from crypto exchanges. And usually they target two regions at the same time. And they do this in order to conceal who they are actually attacking. So for example, they mix targeting Spain and Canada, for example, or they mix Japan and New Zealand. But in reality, they are not attacking both regions. They are only focusing on one and trying to divert attention. So when you unpack one of their samples, you will notice that there's missing strings for the languages of the countries they seem to be attacking. And this way, it can be proven that they are not actually targeting all of the countries that they show in the injections. The core functionality is rather small, but is effective and is able to steal the credentials from users from banks. Every setting that they have can be configured remotely on every server update with the command and control. The way they distribute this malware is through malicious advertisement campaigns. So they try to lead the user into a website that tells them that they are infected, and they will provide a solution for them. And it will redirect the user to a shady website to download the final payload. This final payload is hosted using trusted services or hard to take down compromised websites. The most interesting one is Discord and GitHub. They had a GitHub account with 159 commits updating their payload. And it is the user in bold letters, which is now taken down. And they also use Discord as a secure file hosting because it takes time to actually be detected by them. And this will be the advertisement campaign scheme that they use. You will fall into an advertising telling you that you're infected and end up in a fake Google Play website. And below is an activity map of the times they have been updating their payload on GitHub. The core functionality, I'm going to go down to the most interesting part because we don't have much time. So they use PNC to observe and take control of the victim's device, and they try to pair this with their keylogger functionality to be able to infer what what the user is typing and where just from the screenshots that they are grabbing from the PNC. Also, they are able to remove other remote administration tools that the user may have. So if there's AnyDesk software, TeamViewer software, or Hamachi software, anything BNC related, they will uninstall it to ensure that they are the only ones able to use VNC. Also, they hide push notifications from the applications they are targeting. So this way, they are able to stay hidden from the victim because the victim won't notice that they are being attacked or being robbed whenever it is happening. This way, when you receive your second factor authentication code, they will read them, the attackers will read them, but they will hide them from the user. And when you are being stolen money, you will receive a notification from your bank saying you have spent $100, but you won't be able to see it because they will try to hide it to do as much damage as possible in a very short time. And also they try to take advantage of the accessibility API in Android to steal the PIN and the passcode to unlock their device at will. The CTU communications are encrypted using AES, CBC, and then they will they will use base64 to conceal this encrypted payload, and then they will send it to the remote command and control compressed with gzip. This list of domains is only given to the Trojan itself when it has validated the victim. So it won't give the list of actual command and controls until it verifies that it is not a sandbox or that it is not under a analyst sandbox. The ACE key share among many of their samples, depending on the campaign. And the best strategy is to keep a storage of the keys to be able to try all of them before having to manually analyze the sample. By instrumenting the function secret key speak in the constructor, it is possible to obtain the encryption method and the key that they are using. And the last part is the unpacking. When you analyze the sample is packed, so it is not possible to analyze statically what they are doing. And when you open it in a decompiler, you will see that there's no code. And the reason for that is that the real payload is hidden in the resources section of the APK. And they use a library which is loaded on the application startup to actually decrypt it. When it is decrypted, they will execute the payload and the user will receive the real Trojan. They will be actually infected. This library uses RC4 to decrypt the payload, and the key is also shared among many samples. So the best strategy also is to keep track of the keys that they are using to statically decrypt the payload. The only issue is that the real payload is also using encrypted strings, but luckily they have a method inside the code to decrypt them. And if you take advantage of their own method, you can decrypt all the strings. Not until if you don't decrypt the strings, you won't be sure who they are really attacking, because in the strings, you might notice that there's strings for Spanish, English, Italian, for example, but there's no strings for Portuguese, even though they are in the list. So they are probably not targeting this country. To extract the key, we can use Frida for runtime extraction. And the way to do it automatically with this instrumentation code is to hook the DL open call for an Android. and wait until the malicious library is loaded. Once this library is loaded, we can instrument it and then get the function that is encrypting the payload. Since this function is actually receiving the key for decryption, we can read it, and in their case, it's always the third argument of this function. So by running the sample and using this instrumentation code, we can extract the RC4 key that they are using in a couple of seconds. Once we have this key, we can reuse it for all their campaign until they change it to an either one, in which case we can reuse this method. And that's it for now. You can request me a more detailed analysis if you need it. And you can also ask me through a Slack if you want, or you can ping me through my email. Thank you, everyone.